So that was a very interesting and exhaustive also viewpoint. Now I will ask Gary, who is not vice chairman, but a senior vice president, so I correct in passing, to give a very concrete view of what the business community in the US is expecting from such from such a body. If any, if you expect anything, or do you expect anything, and what? And I think that relating to the remarks of Yemin, how do you think Trump, how do you think about the way Trump thinks about these kind of organizations? Apparently, he doesn't seem to be very interested.
Well, thank you, Thierry. Thank you for inviting me. It's fascinating to listen to real insiders for G7 and G20 process, and what I can do is to offer an outsider's view. The business community represented by the US Chamber of Commerce, the largest business advocacy group in the United States, started paying attention to G7 around 2007. And the first thing we did was to call on our counterparts in France, in MEDEF, in Canada, Germany, Japan, Italy, and the European Union, and UK, which was then in the European Union, as we recall. We shared the same feeling of unease in 2007. If you remember, at that time, there was a lot of tension, political tension, between Washington, Paris, and Berlin. Some people insisted on renaming French fries in the cafeterias of the greatest deliberating body in the United States. We felt that at the peak of globalization, when we looked at each other as competitors but also partners, the governments were trying to pull us apart and wrap us into national flags and say that, you know, you're an American company, you have to behave this way, you're a French company, you have to be this way, etc. And that's not the way the businesses we represented felt. So we decided to get together and have a private meeting of leaders of the largest business lobbyists and find out whether we have something in common and what we can do to help our companies keep gaining the economies of scale through globalization. So 2007, we had our first meeting and we formed Business 7. And a year later, financial crisis started and we saw the elevation of G20, and we decided to keep our eye on G7 process for the simple reason. We did not calculate the share of GDP. We did not look at the numbers. We had a very simple strategy. These are rule makers. Rule makers are getting together and creating rules, or at least a shared analysis of what's right and wrong in our economies, and they are not asking the actual actors in these economies, business community, their opinion about the future. We wanted G7 to offer a shared narrative of economic growth coming out of the financial crisis in economies where most of our multinationals are based, pay their taxes, develop their innovation, where their bankers are based, and we were completely shut out of the process. G20, as Ambassador said, became more important on many levels during the financial crisis. It begat some institutions like the Financial Stability Board and others, and we paid a lot of attention to that, so we formed a parallel group, Business 20, but we kept the 7 for the same reason, regulatory power. And as you have all seen, in the wake of the financial crisis, the states got a lot more influence, a lot more self-assuredness, I would say, that they know how to manage crises, they know how economies should work, they know how to set the rules, and they saw many companies fail, Some of the leading companies failed in 2008, 2011. Many companies had to be bailed. So the governments felt that they are in charge, and they were. But for us in the private sector, that was a completely different universe compared to 2007. So we still look at G7 with the same eyes. There is a difference. I must tell you that there is a lot more interest right now in the business community about G7, starting with the German presidency, 2 years ago? When we realized that G20 was reflecting the dysfunctionalities of geopolitics, and G7 is regaining or consolidating its influence over international institutions, over rules of the financial markets, rules over industrial policies, not even rules, not in the legal terms, but the shared way of describing global problems, the shared language of describing capacities and limitations of governments and private sector, the shared difficulties of generating growth in our mature economies. And that's why we started paying a lot more attention to meetings of G7 principals, but also ministers. If you think about this, throughout the year, the ministers and deputy ministers of energy, transport, tourism, finance, health, keep meeting together with no private sector being there, and precisely because these are not treaty-based fora, they frequently bypass the normal process. They get involved, the staff, as they wish, and that creates, flexibility, but also lack of transparency. So all the more reason for the private sector to be interested and try to insert ourselves. And we did, and last year, the Italian presidency under Prime Minister Meloni was exceptionally eager to engage private sector in all of the ministerial meetings, as long as the key conversation was about digital economy. So we had our bandwidth, and we were involved, and that's why it was particularly interesting. So it is, the expectation from G7 is that it will keep setting the narrative in this world where content is king, frankly, and politicians respond to what's being phrased by others and pick up that narrative. Even today, at the opening session, you saw political and religious leaders echoing what was said by G7 10 years ago about climate, inclusivity, etc. These were the words that were introduced by G7, and they're still working. Although political cycles have turned, new presidents, new prime minister, President Trump, will walk into the same meeting, but more importantly, all of his staff will walk into those interagency meetings, and they will have to speak that language. They will have to understand what the history is. They may not like it, they may like it, doesn't matter. They're there for 4 years. G7 has been around. But they will have to understand what's going on. And that's really the reason private sector is very keen to be involved. This year, the presidency is Canada, next France. I don't know whether that fits your middle power definition, Thierry. And then the United States. And France will be chairing G7 when the United States chairs G20. I can assure you that business community will be working together. We won't read all those thousands of pages. We'll have our very narrow interests, finding those areas where governments may help or impede economic growth. And that's where companies will direct their representatives and others to focus and find ways for politicians to listen. That's really all we see from outside. And last point about G7, we'd hate to see G7 being defined by what it's not. It should not be defined by what BRICS is doing. It should be defined by what G7 is doing for its own citizens, its own businesses, and do the best it can. In terms of expansion, we'll leave that to politicians, but governments that set the rules for large markets, we want to interact with them individually, and we want to be part of any of their collective endeavors.
Thank you very much, Gary.